Greetings and salutations. This is the Adjutant, and tonight I want to talk about something that took me many years to fully understand. Not intellectually, emotionally. There's a difference, because sometimes you can know something your entire life, but one day you finally feel the truth of it. And for me, one of the deepest realizations of life was this. I had to raise myself. Not financially, not physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. I've been teaching myself how to survive since childhood. Now, I want to be very careful with this story because this story is not about hatred. It's not about bitterness. It's not revenge. It's not about any of those things. And it's not about publicly condemning family members. That's not my spirit. And truthfully, I reached a stage in life where anger no longer interests me very much at all. Reflection interests me. Wisdom interests me. Peace interests me. Understanding interests me. But I do believe there is value in honest reflection, especially for people who quietly carry wounds they've never fully spoken about. And there are many people like that. Many. People functioning every day, working jobs, raising children, serving in the military, smiling publicly, while privately carrying emotional pain that started decades earlier. Pain they learned to bury because survival required it. That was me. I grew up in tremendous dysfunction, tremendous instability, fear, violence, emotional chaos. My mother struggled deeply with severe mental illness, and the home environment I was born into was profoundly traumatic. At one point, after discovering that my older sister had been sexually abused by my father, my mother shot him 7 times. Now imagine that. Imagine the level of pain and rage, madness, and brokenness required for a situation like that to even exist. And despite all of that, despite the violence, despite the trauma, despite the institutionalization, they reunited, and eventually I was born into that environment. So from the very beginning, my understanding of family, love, safety, and stability was fractured. And children may not always understand dysfunction intellectually, but they feel it emotionally. Children absorb tension. They absorb fear. They absorb criticism. They absorb instability. And when you grow up inside emotional chaos long enough, your nervous system adapts to survival. You become hyper alert, hyper independent, emotionally guarded. You learn how to read rooms quickly. You learn how to suppress emotions quickly. You learn how to compartmentalize, and eventually you stop expecting rescue. That's the part people rarely talk about. There comes a point where some children unconsciously realize nobody's coming. And once that realization settles into the nervous system, it changes you. My father constantly criticized me, constantly. He compared me negatively to my mother, told me I would never amount to anything, made me feel very small. And the strange thing about children or childhood criticism is that even when you consciously reject it, part of it still enters your nervous system. Part of it still lives inside your subconscious. So while I carry deep faith in the Most High, and while I genuinely loved myself internally, there was also insecurity, fear, there was embarrassment, self-doubt, confusion, loneliness, a deep loneliness. Now, I want to say something here important. Despite everything I experienced, I was never suicidal. Never. I think part of the reason was because deep inside, I always believed my life had purpose. I didn't know what that purpose was yet, but I believed the Most High had not created me accidentally. That belief stayed with me, even during the darkest moments. And then, at 17 years old, just 6 months before graduating high school, my father kicked me out the house. I remember the humiliation of that. Not just the fear, the humiliation. Because when you're young, you compare yourself to everybody else. You look around and think, why is my life like this? I remember feeling invisible, emotionally numb, terrified, ashamed, especially because people often assume emotional abandonment only exists when somebody has no family. But that's not true. Sometimes people feel surrounded by relatives, yet emotionally abandoned. And that was one of the hardest realizations of my life. I had parents, I had siblings, extended family, relatives with money, historical legacy, connections, and yet when my life was collapsing emotionally, nobody came. Nobody rescued me. Nobody stepped in and said, this child matters. And I remember slowly realizing something terrifying. I had emotionally been raising myself all along. I had taught myself resilience, taught myself emotional survival, taught myself discipline, taught myself compartmentalization, taught myself how to keep moving while hurting. And while that realization was painful, it also explained why I had become so hyper-independent. People often praise hyper-independence in men, but psychologically, hyper-independence is often a trauma response. It's what happens when vulnerability feels unsafe, when dependence feels dangerous, when asking for help feels humiliating. You stop believing support is reliable, so you learn to survive alone. And eventually, you become so good at surviving alone that people assume you don't need love or support or gentleness. But every human being needs those things, even strong men, especially strong men. Eventually, a family allowed me to stay with them long enough to finish high school. And I always appreciate that. I truly will. But even then, I could still feel emotionally that I was abandoned, that people tolerated me more than wanted me. And when you already carry abandonment wounds, you become extremely sensitive to emotional energy. You notice hesitation, distance, discomfort, silence. You become emotionally observant because survival trained you to be that way. So during that period, I survived by compartmentalizing my life, one day at a time, emotional compartment at a time. And psychologically, that's actually how many traumatized people survive. They narrow life down into manageable emotional pieces. Because if they fully feel everything all at once, it just becomes overwhelming. So instead, they function. They move forward. They stay disciplined. They suppress and they survive. That became my strategy. And then graduation came, and I remember standing there uncertain about the future, afraid, emotionally exhausted, trying to act stronger than I felt. And that's when something happened that I have never forgotten. I heard a quiet inner voice say, "Don't worry, Tommy. Everything's going to be all right." I cannot fully explain that moment. I just knew it was real. And for me, that became one of the most foundational spiritual anchors of my life. Because there are moments in life where the Most High Yahweh speaks quietly, not loudly, quietly. And if you're paying attention, those moments can carry you for decades. That carried me. Because shortly afterward, the military became my salvation. And I mean that sincerely. The military gave me food, it gave me shelter, it gave me structure, discipline, identity, purpose, and direction. And perhaps most importantly, it gave me an environment where every effort mattered, where discipline mattered, where performance mattered. Now, for the first time in my life, I entered a system where I could build myself through structure. And that changed everything. People often misunderstand why the military transforms some men so deeply. It's not just the uniform, it's not just the patriotism. For some young men, especially those coming from chaos, the military becomes the first stable structure they've ever experienced, the first predictable environment, the first constant standard, the first time life feels ordered. And when you come from emotional instability, structure can feel like salvation. The military didn't magically erase my trauma, but it did give me direction. And direction can save a human being, especially a young man. I became disciplined, focused, driven, responsible. And over time, I built a life that would have seemed impossible to a frightened 17-year-old boy. Military officer, attorney, college professor, Veterans Administration adjudicator, known as a raider, leadership roles, responsibility, influence, stability. But what moves me emotionally now is not the success itself. It's the boy who survived long enough to reach it. That's the part that affects me now, because the older I get, the more compassion I feel for younger versions of myself. I look back now, I don't see weakness. I see a child trying to survive circumstances he never should have had to carry. And despite all of it, he still became compassionate, still became disciplined, still developed a moral compass, still believed in the Most High, Yahweh, still wanted to help people, still wanted to become honorable. That matters deeply to me, because one of the greatest fears people from traumatic homes carry is the fear of becoming the dysfunction they came from. That fear is very real. You become terrified that chaos inside your environment somehow entered your blood permanently. But one of the greatest lessons I've learned is this: you can come from chaos without becoming chaos. You can survive abandonment without abandoning yourself. You can experience dysfunction without becoming dysfunctional. And sometimes the people who come from the darkest environments become the most compassionate adults because they know what suffering feels like. They know what loneliness feels like. They know what fear feels like. And because they know those feelings intimately, they become more careful with other human beings. Now, don't misunderstand me. Trauma leaves scars. It absolutely does. Hyper-independence, emotional guardedness, difficulty trusting, difficulty asking for help, feeling emotionally safest alone. These things don't disappear magically, but healing teaches you awareness, and awareness changes everything. Because once you understand why you became certain ways, you stop hating yourself for surviving. That's important. You stop condemning yourself for adaptations your nervous system developed to stay emotionally alive. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what happened to me? That shift changes people. And I also learned something else over time. Strength is the decision to remain principled despite pain. That's some real truth there. Remaining compassionate despite betrayal. Remaining disciplined despite instability. Remaining moral despite dysfunction. Remaining spiritually grounded despite suffering. That is strength. I think in the Bible of Job. Read the book of Job whenever you get a chance. And honestly, I think many men are quietly carrying stories like this. Stories they never tell. Stories buried underneath productivity, underneath careers, underneath leadership, underneath masculinity, underneath stoicism. Many people learn very early that vulnerability is unsafe, so they buried entire emotional worlds just to survive. And sometimes those boys become highly successful men while still privately carrying emotional loneliness nobody sees. That's one reason I share these stories now. Not for sympathy, not for pity, but because I know there are people listening who need to hear this. People who quietly believe their childhood disqualified them from peace, disqualified them from purpose, disqualified them from becoming good human beings. And I want them to understand something clearly. Your environment may shape you, but it does not have absolute authority over who you become. The Most High Yahweh still gives human beings choice, discipline, conscience, purpose, direction, and that matters. Sometimes I sit quietly now and I think about that 17-year-old boy standing there uncertain about his future. No safety net, no emotional stability, no roadmap, just fear, faith, and survival. And honestly, I'm proud of him, deeply proud of him. Not because he became successful, but because he survived without losing his humanity. That's the real victory. He survived chaos without becoming cruel, survived abandonment without abandoning himself, survived dysfunction without surrendering his moral compass. And I think that's one of the greatest testimonies a human being can carry. Not perfection, character. Not status, integrity. Not money, humanity. So if you're listening to this tonight and you came from emotional chaos, I want you to hear me clearly. Your story is not over. Your childhood was not the final chapter. Your pain is not your identity. And even if nobody came to save you, your life still has purpose. Sometimes the Most High, Yahweh, plants strength inside people long before they understand why they need it. Sometimes the people who survive the hardest beginnings become the very people capable of bringing wisdom, compassion, stability, and healing into the world later. So no, I don't look back on my story with bitterness anymore. I look back with understanding, with compassion, sadness sometimes, but also with gratitude. Because somehow, through all the chaos, the Most High, Yahweh, still guided my path. And so there you have it. I hope this has been helpful. This is the Adjutant. I'll see you in the next one. I wish you all blessings and blessings. Shalom.